All right, well, good morning. Thank you for joining us here today for the second in our MDICx teleconference series. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I'm the program manager for MDIC's Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Assessment Project. And it's my pleasure to give you a little bit of an overview today and introduce our two speakers. We have a number of draft materials that we're going to be circulating to MDIC members in the coming week. And the purpose of this teleconference today is to introduce you to the work that our steering committee and our working groups have been working so hard on, and to tell you a little bit about what we've produced and what kind of feedback we're looking for from MDIC members. For those of you who aren't familiar with MDIC, MDIC is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a public-private partnership focused exclusively on the regulatory science of medical devices. Because we're a public-private partnership, we're able to bring together resources and people from the FDA, CMS, NIH, from large and small industry groups, and also from nonprofits, including patient groups, providers, and academics. The Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project was one of 3 inaugural projects of MDIC. All of our projects are proposed by and brought to MDIC by our members, so we work on projects that are of interest and importance to our members first. And the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Assessment Project came out of a guidance from CDRH in 2012 on factors to consider for benefit risk assessment in devices. This was a landmark policy statement on the part of CDRH, as it was the first and only regulatory guidance on benefit risk. There were a number of important implications of this CDRH guidance. First of all, it meant standardization amongst CDRH staff on benefit risk assessment, which is ultimately a basis for regulatory approval. What this means is that a product is potentially approvable if the benefit exceeds the risk for a given patient population. This benefit risk assessment guidance also said that the benefit risk assessment should reflect the patient perspective. That is, that a product should be approvable if there is a subset of reasonable patients that would accept the risk given the benefits. Now, this guidance discusses the potential value of patient preference information, but not when or how to collect such information. And that's where this project from CDRH came in, or from MDIC came in. And a number of members of our steering committee had done some previous research on this and really showed why this is an important thing for us to think about and to consider. In this study on preferences for anticoagulants, physicians and patients were both asked to identify what their primary concerns were with regards to risk. And we see here that the concerns were different for patients versus physicians. Therefore, it shows that it's important that the patient perspective should be considered in benefit risk assessments, because patients are the ones ultimately living with the condition, and they're ultimately the ones living with the risks of a given product. The MDIC Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project sought to establish a credible framework for assessing patient preferences regarding the probable benefits and risks of a proposed medical device, and ultimately a framework for incorporating this patient preference information into pre-market and post-market regulatory submissions and decisions. To do this, MDIC brought together a team of experts from medical device companies, regulatory agencies, nonprofits, and academia to help develop a suite of tools to bring the patient perspective into the regulatory process. We had 3 key focus areas in this effort. One was when and how should information on patient preferences be collected and incorporated into the regulatory process? What methods are available to assess patient preferences? And as a nascent field, what additional work needs to be done to improve the ability to assess and incorporate patient preferences into regulatory decision-making? Out of this project, we have 2 key deliverables that are going to be integrated into one report. As I mentioned at the beginning, these materials are going to be available for review from MDIC members in the coming week. This is a valuable part of our development process that we want to make sure that the tools we're developing are useful to our members. The tools that we're going to be discussing today are a framework for incorporating information on patient preferences regarding benefit and risk, and also a catalog of methods that are available for assessing patient preferences for benefits and harms of medical technologies. We anticipate publication of the full reports to be happening in May of this year. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to mention, and I should have mentioned this right at the beginning, we do encourage your questions. At the top of your screen, you have a little bar that has 5 buttons on it. One of them looks like a little chat bubble. If you click that, you can type your questions into that box that comes up, and we're going to devote 15 minutes at the end to answering whatever questions you have. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the hard work of our steering committee members. As I mentioned, our steering committee is drawn from our member organizations, and their hard work has made these reports possible. So again, I have so much appreciation for the hard work that this committee is doing and continues to do, and we hope that the products that we're ultimately producing from this will be useful to all of our members. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brett Hauber from RTI Health Solutions, who was partnering with us on developing a catalog of patient preference methods.
Thanks, Stephanie. So this is the appendix, essentially, to the report, and I guess Ross will be describing the report in more detail lately. But the catalog itself focuses on what methods are available and what the characteristics of those methods are. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So the objectives of the report were to assess the methods that are currently available, specifically patient preference methods that are designed to evaluate or elicit benefit-risk preferences. In order to get there, first we needed to start with defining what we mean by patient preferences. There are a number of different potential definitions out there, no clear specific consensus, and not anything that is specific to benefit risk. So we started there. Then we needed to think about, well, which methods should we include? So we developed some criteria to evaluate methods against in order to say, does this fit as a viable patient preference method? Then we had to identify the methods that met those criteria. Once we had assembled those, then came what is probably the most challenging part, and that is developing criteria against which to evaluate those methods and then to actually conduct the evaluation. Next slide, please. Once we've done all that, the goal is to then take this list of methods with the characteristics that we've known, that we've evaluated, and to indicate where in the product life cycle these different types of methods may be useful. Really what that means is for what different purposes would different methods be more or less useful. And then because this is still a relatively nascent field, and because these methods come from so many different disciplines and have been applied to a greater or lesser extent to benefit risk analysis, in the end what we really want to do is identify gaps. Where are methods not available, where are current methods available but maybe don't have a track record, where are methods available and the properties are just not particularly well known. So we're going to look at both where things fit in terms of the product life cycle and in the end hopefully have a good robust gap analysis. So the definition of patient preference methods, and I'm actually going to spend a couple slides on this, is presented here. Quantitative assessments of the relative desirability or acceptability of features that differ among alternative medical technologies. It's a bit of a mouthful, but everything that's in there is in there for a reason. If we can go into the next slide, please. First of all, we've limited the catalog to quantitative assessments. There are qualitative methods out there for getting a sense of patient preferences. If we can click through. But really, in order to get weighting of benefits and risks and compare things in a common metric, we really need something quantitative. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a high level of statistical inference is required, but we need a number of some sort. If we can click through, please. The other requirement for patient preferences is that they be relative. And what we mean by relative is that we can put things in a common metric. We can compare preferences for one outcome to preferences for another outcome. After all, that is the goal of what we want to do, is to come up with some sense of a final judgment of whether the benefits of a technology outweigh the risk. Go to the next slide, please. We define preferences particularly here in terms of desirability and acceptability. And the reason we did this was it seems odd to a lot of people to talk about preferences for a bad outcome, because preferences to a lot of people refer to, to positive things. So, we're looking at desirability or preference for achieving a positive outcome, and that would be the benefits that we would be looking at. And then acceptability, which would be the preferences for avoiding a negative outcome. And again, we need to get those on the same scale. So we're looking at relative desirability or acceptability. Next slide, please. And then the key thing here is the features that differ among alternative medical technologies. Is because really when we're doing a benefit-risk analysis, what we need to know is what we're evaluating compared to the alternative. And the alternative could be a current standard of care. It could be an alternative technology. But in the end, what we really need to do is to be able to say the incremental benefits and the incremental risk relative to what is available currently, where do they stack up? And then what conclusions can we draw? Next slide, please. Okay, so we need to step back just a little bit and look at the context of preferences in an overall benefit-risk assessment. So a benefit-risk assessment is that we have some data about the benefits and the harms related to a treatment, and they may be known well or not known well. They could be probable or well-established. Then we have to put some kind of weighting scheme around them, which is really the value judgment of, how important are the benefits, how important are the risks, and when we apply them to the data, what does that say about the net benefits of the medical technology? So some preference methods, like those used in multi-criteria decision-making that are included in the catalog, really are a piece of a larger exercise as they are traditionally used. Next slide, please. And these would be true when we're talking about the structured weighting methods that are used in multi-criteria decision analysis or analytic hierarchy process, where the goal of those exercises is to come to a decision of some sort. So there is much more around the preference elicitation portion of this than just the preference elicitation itself. It is typically administered in a broader context. If we can go to the next slide. What we really want to focus, though, on is that center piece here. What are the methods that can be used to elicit the weights? And in the previous slide, we showed that there are some that are used as in part of a larger process. But then there are some methods that focus specifically and solely on getting the weights. If we can click to the next slide, please. Some we estimate one weight at a time. So we take a given outcome or endpoint or feature and get a weight for that feature. Often this is what we see if we look at health state utilities. We can then get a number on each of the items, and they could be elicited, in the same survey or maybe not. But the point is that we get a number for each outcome that's measured on a common scale. The alternative, if we can click to the next slide, is that some methods that we look at actually elicit weights over a full decision simultaneously. And in this case, conjoint analysis and discrete choice experiments have been used to create a survey where we are eliciting weights jointly for everything as opposed to doing separate analyses for individual weights. And then some methods actually look at actual decisions, and this has been a bit of a challenge for us. There are some methods out there that look at patients' actual preferences for what would you do, and these tend to be what we call revealed preference methods, where we have an opportunity to actually observe what people do. And the two examples of that would be to ask direct questions at the end of a crossover trial, where people have had the opportunity to experience two medical technologies and then choose which one they want to continue with. Then there is a thing called a patient preference trial, where at least some people in the trial are allowed to choose their arm. So they're actually revealing what their preferences are for an overall good. And then if you can click through to the next one, what we need to do in those cases is work backwards and then infer the weights based on the difference in the alternatives over which people had the opportunity to choose. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay. As I mentioned before, what we focus on here are the methods that can be used to elicit these weights. So we're really focused on the middle here. So when we talk about the methods that are used in multi-criteria decision methods, we're really looking at the weighting component of those. If we can move on. Okay. So then once we established what we meant by patient preferences and kind of got the framework around where they fit in so that we kind of had a focus on what we were doing, we then needed to say, well, okay, if we have a list, how do we determine what goes in and what doesn't? So we had to develop some criteria. And the first one is we need to be able to get these weights. The second one is, they've got to be out there. They can't be just purely theoretic. So our standard for that was that they have some basis in a peer-reviewed literature. But we didn't want to only include those that had been used specifically for benefit-risk analysis, because there are some methods out there that could very well be used but may not have been used specifically in this application before. So we didn't want to limit that. As long as there is a track record of eliciting patient preferences, they didn't necessarily need to be benefit-risk preferences if they could be adapted easily to estimate benefit-risk preferences. Let me go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's the current list of methods. So the first group is the structured weighting list, and that is the list of those items that are typically used as part of a multi-criteria decision method. Then there are health state utilities. Health state utilities are technically stated preference methods, but the way they are elicited and the way they are used have certain properties that make them somewhat distinct from the more general type of stated preference method. And among the stated preference methods, discrete choice experiments, conjoint analysis, and best worst scaling are the ones that have been used most recently in benefit risk. And then we have the revealed preference ones that I had mentioned before: patient preference trials, direct questions in clinical trials, particularly crossover trials. And then there's an additional one known as the Norton method, which is primarily a method for visualizing benefits and risks and their relation to dropping out of a trial. We can go to the next slide. So then once we had this list, we had to try and figure out what can we say about these to get us closer to determining which methods would be appropriate in which cases for benefit risk analysis. So we needed to develop some criteria around which to evaluate these methods. As we were doing that, we realized that there is a distinction between the method itself and the implementation of the method, and that there are certain issues around implementation that are independent of the method but can affect the quality and the interpretability and the applicability of a given study. So we wound up peeling those out as a separate topic for discussion in the catalog. And the first is, whenever these things are done, there needs to be a really clear research question. There's an overall research question for the benefit risk assessment, but we need a specific research question also applied to the preference elicitation. And that involves what is it are we actually trying to measure, and then how do we want to use those measurements in the end. Then there are issues regarding the sample. Most of these items require primary data collection, meaning that we have to go out and ask. We have to ask patients in some structured format to provide information to us. So the question becomes, who do we ask? And then once we've asked, what can we say about a broader population based on who we asked? So those are really more survey research methods than they are specific to any of the individual methods included in the catalog. Then there's the issue of heterogeneity in preferences, and this is a challenge because it is often important to determine whether there are different subgroups of people with different preferences. Not everybody is going to agree. Sometimes we can evaluate those preferences or test for differences based on things we can observe, such as age or gender or health history or previous experiences with the technology. But there are also unobserved differences in preferences where I can't necessarily explain them, where two people could look exactly alike on paper but just have very different preferences, because preferences are such a personal thing. So the issue of preference heterogeneity is partly related to the sample, and do I have a diverse population? But it's also related to, can I capture some of this unobserved heterogeneity in preferences where I can't explain it based on characteristics, but I still know there's a range within there. And again, that is in large measure independent of the method itself. And then there's this question of validity. How do we know that what we are getting is valid? Validity is particularly difficult in stated preference methods, but it's something that needs to be addressed, and there may be some gaps in this area, and kind of to give you a teaser as to what might be coming in the future, is to try and understand how can we assess the validity of these methods in any particular application. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So once we took these kind of implementation-related things off the table, we then came up with a set of criteria with which to evaluate the methods. And the first is what is the method, what we call methodology criteria. How do you actually get your data, and what's required in implementing or even just developing the instrument that you're going to field. Then there are questions about the sample, and this is independent necessarily or in part of the broader issue of what's the right sample. This is, does the method itself require a certain sample size or limit the sample, and what do we need to get from patients, and how hard is it going to be for them to do this, and is it even possible? And then if we can go to the next slide. The third, go back one. Thank you. The third set of criteria is what we're calling output criteria, and this is, what do you get from the method? And this could potentially be, kind of critical to determining which method is most appropriate in any given application. If you have a need and you've defined what the need is for patient preference information, and you've defined that well, our hope is that we can then look at the ability of these different methods to provide those outputs as a means of determining which method may be most appropriate and really most efficient in getting the information that is needed. And then finally, in the next slide, if we can move on, the last set of criteria are what we're calling resource criteria. How much time does it take to do one of these studies? How much does it cost to do one of these studies? Included in here as well as what level of experience is necessary to either be able to do one of these studies or use the results of one of these studies, and what level of expertise is required, because that varies substantially among the methods. Generally speaking, we are able to categorize the methods based on the resource requirements, but it's kind of a very broad brush that we're taking here because, as one of the members of the working group pointed out, we could do a very simple methodology but do a very time-consuming and expensive study, and we could do a very complex methodology and do it kind of quick and dirty. So it's been a bit of a challenge to get these together, but our hope is that, having thought through this, we will be able to give general guidelines on those studies that take longer or take less time, and those that cost more or those that cost less. If we go to the next slide, please. So in the end, this is intended to be a resource, and we're trying to structure it such that sponsors and FDA staff, researchers, and other decision makers or stakeholders can go to this document and understand, A, generally speaking, what is this method, what does it do? And B, hopefully be able to say, okay, this type of method or this group of methods is appropriate in this case, but may not be appropriate in another case. So it is meant to be a resource rather than a guidance document. We can go to the next slide. And I guess that's it for the catalog. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Brett. And I'll next introduce Ross Jaffe, who's a member of MDIC's board and the board champion for the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the framework.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And I thank you all for participating this morning. As Brett noted, the catalog we're developing is a unique document. It's the first time that someone's done a comprehensive document bringing together all the methods available to assess patient preferences. And so we think that document's valuable in and of itself. But we thought it would be much more valuable if we could put that document in a context, an overall arching framework about how one might think about using patient preferences in regulatory evaluation of new medical technologies. And so the catalog is actually going to end up being an appendix to what we're calling the framework report, which is a report that should serve as a resource for industry members, FDA staff, other groups, academia, on how to think about when and how to collect patient preference information and how that might be incorporated into the regulatory process. It's important to note that we don't believe this is going to be the definitive document in this area. Rather, the way to think about it is a first document in this area, a working document that is designed to really be a thought piece, and that's initial in an area that, as Brett mentioned, is a very nascent area. We're hoping that over time, as we all gain experience in looking at patient preferences, that we can continue to revise this framework document and make it increasingly useful and valuable over time. I think it's also important to note what the document is not. It's not a policy document of the FDA. It doesn't represent recommendations of MDIC to the FDA. It's also not a substitute for any FDA guidance or discussion with FDA about these topics. It's really designed to be a conceptual thought piece to help a variety of stakeholders, be it from industry, FDA, patient organizations, academia, others, think about how patient preference information can be collected and used. Next slide. So this gives an overview of the entire framework, and what we're going to do this morning is walk through just sort of each of the 8 sections of the framework, and this gives you a sense of the overall layout. We start with an introduction, giving some background. We'll talk about the second chapter really focuses on definitions and background concepts. The third section focuses on thinking about in what situations do you want to collect patient preference information. The fourth chapter focuses on when in the product development life cycle you can or might want to collect such information. The fifth chapter really builds on the catalog and talks about how you might think about undertaking a patient preference study. The 6th chapter focuses on some additional considerations in using patient preference information in the regulatory process, a series of questions that we as a steering committee came up and thought about and discussed. The 7th chapter focuses on the potential value of patient preference information beyond the regulatory context, specifically in the areas of reimbursement, marketing, and shared medical decision-making. And then in the 8th chapter, as Brett alluded to, we will look at sort of what are the next steps, where can additional work that be done that might further enhance this field. And that's both in terms of methods and in the broader thinking about how to use this information. Next slide. So the introductory chapter really contains some background on MDIC and why we undertook the patient-centered benefit risk, or the PCBR project. It also discusses the process we went through in taking on the project and who our steering committee members are, and then outlines the remainder of the report. Next slide, please. The second section gets at some very important definitional issues and conceptual issues to get everybody reading the document on the same page. There are a number of terms that people throw around in this field that can be used in different ways depending on where you come from. Some are used in lay terms, others are used in academic or technical ways. Even within academia, there are different groups that use these terms differently. So we thought it would be important to define such terms as patient preferences. What's the difference between preferences and judgment? Issues of risk attitude, risk tolerance, and particularly perhaps the most important concept that we focus on there is what is a preference-sensitive decision? What are the types of situations in which patient preferences really matter and can come into play? And so that second chapter really focuses on these definitional issues. Next slide, please. The third section of the report really tries to get at the issue in what situations would patient preference information be useful in regulatory decision-making. And in thinking about this, we decided that there's no one cookbook or algorithmic way to think about these issues. Rather, we approached this in more of a factors to consider approach and define 3 sets of factors, broad sets of factors that might help guide one to decide whether or not patient preference information might be valuable. There's some factors related to the perspective as patients and stakeholders. You know, how are there differences in how different patients would view the choice around a particular use of a particular therapy or particular technology. There are factors related to the benefit-risk trade-offs inherent in a particular technology. In some technologies, the benefits are so clear and the risks are so low that patient preference information is probably not that valuable. In other areas where there are high risks but also significant potential benefits, such information may be much more valuable. And then there's some third factors related to regulatory novelty. When we don't really haven't thought about a new area, a new technology, how can patient preference information help clarify what should be the regulatory requirements in that area? And so we focus somewhat on those issues as well. And at the end of the chapter, we outline a series of questions that FDA staff or sponsors or others can ask to really help think about in what situations such patient preference information would be useful. Next slide, please. So where the prior section talked about in what situations patient preference information may be valuable, Section 4 really focuses on when in the product development life cycle it might be useful to collect such information, and talks about the role of patient preference information is really, we see twofold. One is to identify the benefit-risk issues around a particular technology, help to understand what the benefit-risk topics of the discussion should be focused on, and also then to identify subgroups of patients with relevant differences in preferences who might be willing to accept the benefits, the risk of the technology for the benefits. So what are the patient populations that might want to choose this technology based on its benefits and risk? And if we can define the issues and then help identify subpopulations, that could be very valuable in the regulatory process. So if we're going to use this in the regulatory process, of looking at a new medical technology, it's helpful to start thinking about these issues early so that we have the right information at the right time for regulatory decision making. And so this chapter focuses on the stages in the product life cycle. We use the CDRH's product life cycle diagram as a basis for this, and think about what information can be collected at each stage, particularly as you know more about the technology as it goes through that development life cycle. And we think it lends itself to a way of thinking about what information you're going to need at the point of regulatory decision making, and then working backwards through the product development life cycle to figure out where you best can collect such information. We hope that thinking will be helpful, particularly to industry, as they think about collecting and using this information in their regulatory submissions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, section 5 really focuses on factors to consider in undertaking a patient preference study and builds on the methods outlined in the catalog. So the chapter includes a brief discussion of how the catalog was developed and summarizes the methods, but it really then goes on to focus on factors to think about in how you might select among the methods in a particular situation. Again, this is not a cookbook or algorithmic approach, but more laying out a series of factors to think about and asking a series of questions that hopefully can be helpful in guiding thinking and guiding a selection process as you go through designing a patient preference study. Next slide. Section 6 is really some additional considerations in using patient preference information in the regulatory process, and it really addresses some key questions which are listed here. In other words, what roles can patient preference information play in informing CDRH benefit risk determinations? Should patient preference information be included in the labeling? Is that important? And how do we think about labeling in the context of patient preferences? Should patient preference information be included in post-market study requirements? Can we use the post-market period to learn more about patient preferences around a particular technology and perhaps help refine the label or expand indications, expand to different patient populations? Should the patient preference information be required, or should it be optional at the part of the sponsor? How should patient preference information be submitted, and how can it be validated and audited just as we validate and audit other forms of clinical data? And then what is the right time in the product development life cycle to determine if a patient preference information should be collected? That gets back at some of the issues we talked about in Section 4. And then finally, how can patient preference information collected and used to better understand important benefit risk issues in new or evolving areas, and perhaps help guide FDA thinking about what the requirements should be in a new or emerging area? The great example of this is the work that Telba Irony and Martin Ho and several of the other FDA staff members did around obesity in using a patient preference study that was done with the help of Brett and his team at RTI to help understand how patients think about benefit risk trade-offs around weight loss and the risk of using new technologies. And that's led to, I think, some clear regulatory thinking about how to lay out the requirements for new, less invasive approaches to obesity. And so, we discussed a little bit how that can be used in other areas. Can we have the next slide, please? And then Section 7 is really a high-level discussion aimed at just noting that information collected for the regulatory process may have other value in and around a new medical technology. And we think the information could be valuable to payers as they think about their coverage decisions. Patient preferences aren't currently factored in to decisions about whether a technology should or shouldn't be reimbursed, but it may prove to be valuable information for payers as they think about those decisions. It certainly might be valuable in marketing products for companies. And as we evolve into a more patient-centric, evidence-based healthcare system, shared decision-making is becoming an important topic, and the patient preference information we collect around new medical technology may help guide how we inform patients about and help them make their medical decisions. So this section briefly focuses on each of those areas, and just to highlight these topics, and particularly highlight them for areas of future work. Next section, please. Next slide, please. So the final section of the report really is about how we can continue to learn more about this area. And it builds off a gap analysis that Brett and his colleagues in the catalog working group will do around what we need to learn about methods and where there's additional methodological development that could be helpful here, particularly, as Brett mentioned, around how we validate these methods around patient preferences. And there's some additional topics that we as the PCBR steering committee are talking about, and we'll be talking about in an upcoming meeting, to think about what other areas of additional work we might want to encourage others to do as well as undertake at the MDIC level to try to continue to expand and improve our understanding of this field. Next slide. So, Stephanie, you want me to continue here?
Sure.
So, one of the things we want to ask our MDIC membership now is to help us finalize a report by providing feedback on the current draft. We now, by early next week, we'll have a complete draft of this report and of the catalog ready for circulation. And we would love the MDIC members to provide us feedback. We need this feedback in part to meet the requirements of a BAA contract we have with the FDA that has helped fund this project. And but we also want it because we really want to make sure that the product we're going to deliver to the market, deliver to the membership and to the outside world in May, really is valuable and helpful and meets people's needs. So we're planning to circulate the draft framework report and the catalog to the MDIC membership during the week of January 26th, along with a couple forms that you can fill in to give us your feedback on both the framework report and the catalog. The goal is to have those comments back to Stephanie and her team by the week of February 16th, so in about 3 weeks, so that we can get our comments to the FDA in a summary form by the end of the month, in the month of February. Next slide, please. So the high-level questions we want to be answered is, is the purpose and the need for the framework clear? Is the framework understandable? And are there things that aren't clear as you read the report? Are there topics missing from the framework? Are there topics we did not discuss that should be included? And in the end, will this framework report be helpful in your efforts to integrate patient-to-patient perspective into regulatory decision-making and regulatory submissions, regulatory decisions? And then we'll ask a similar set of questions about the catalog. Particularly, we want to make sure the catalog itself is useful in helping people think about how they design and undertake a preference study. So we appreciate if the MDIC members on the call, you read the reports, or have people in your organization who you think are important to do so, read the reports and provide us feedback. We'll take the feedback in any form, and the more detailed, the better. But we would love the high-level summary using the form so that we can provide that feedback to the FDA. Next slide. With that, Stephanie, I'll turn it back to you to answer questions.
Great. So we'd love to answer some questions. We've reserved this last 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions, and on the little toolbar at the top of your screen, there's a chat bubble. If you click on that bubble, you bring up a chat box, and you can type questions in there. A couple of people have asked questions about the availability of slides. We will have slides available, and we also are recording this webinar, so if you'd like to view it again, or if you think this is really fantastic and you want your colleagues to hear about the great work we're doing, we will have that available on MDIC's website shortly after today's presentation. And as Ross mentioned, we are seeking your feedback, and we really value the feedback that MDIC members will be able to bring on these reports. The ultimate goal is that these reports are something that are going to be useful to all of you. So look for emails from me next week that will include the draft framework, the draft catalog, and as Ross mentioned, a couple of worksheets to kind of help you organize your thoughts and kind of answer some key questions that we have about the materials. We'll also be sending an executive summary along with the report so that you have a summarized version that you can share with your colleagues as well. Ross also mentioned, and I'll mention it again, our ability to do this project was in part because of a funding we received through a BAA contract, and this has allowed us to really devote time and resources to this effort. So we appreciate the ability to work on that.
Yeah, those resources are particularly valuable to bring in to help fund Brett and his team at RTI to do the catalog, and particularly to be able to bring in outside experts in these different methodologies together to discuss them. And we couldn't have done that without the financial support from this FDA contract. So no questions from anyone?
We do have a question about on whether in the framework report, if we discuss some of the methods of gathering patient preference information. Ross, I'll let you handle that, but you did mention that in Section 5, we do talk about some of the methods that are available for gathering patient preference information.
Yes, in the report itself, we don't go into a lot of detail about the how-to methodological issues of doing that. That's much more in the catalog, which is an appendix to the report. In Section 5, we really talk at the higher level about what factors you might think about in selecting among methods to design a study. We talk in that chapter about how you think about defining the patient population, the specific research question you're going after, understand the time and resources you have available, and how all those things could influence your decision about what methods to choose. But we really didn't want to be too cookbook or algorithmic about it because it really is situation specific. We're hoping the factors we identified, the questions we ask in that chapter will help people think about the process. But we don't in there specify if you have this situation, here's what you need to do. It's just I don't think we have that level of understanding yet, nor do I think that that's the goal of our report, is to be that specific about the how-to.
And even in the catalog, the how-to is a little bit limited. It's really, the catalog itself is meant to provide an overview of each of the methods and hopefully an understanding of the differences in the characteristics of the methods and the differences in the ability of the different methods to answer different questions, as well as the differences in an assessment of the time and the resources required. But the catalog itself doesn't necessarily even provide a specific how-to. Our goal, and we haven't quite done this yet, is to be able at least to provide references and citations for materials where you can go to learn more about it, as well as examples of work that has been done previously using different types of methods for eliciting benefit-risk preferences.
Great. We have another question here. This question says, will PROs, or patient-reported outcomes, and patient preferences overlap in some studies, or are they very different concepts?
For this purpose, we've actually had that exact discussion among both the working group and the steering committee early on in this process. And essentially, we are treating patient preferences and PROs as separate and unique items, because, and that is really has to do with how we have defined preferences. So in some cases, there is people use them or describe them as being overlapped or of a similar type of information. But for this purpose, for the definition that we have for patient preferences, being able to quantify relative importance and trade-offs. PROs are not designed for that purpose, so we have excluded them from this catalog for that reason.
Great, thank you. Another question, does the report and appendix include analytics methods?
I'm not sure what is meant by analytic methods, but so I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. If the person who asked the question might be able to provide some clarification, that would be helpful. But it's a full range of methods from really very simple to very statistically rigorous, and hopefully everything in between that is reasonable to generate this type of information. In terms whether there are other methods, and that's what is meant by analytic methods, I'm not sure. I think we've tried to cover everything that could be used. If there are additional methods that aren't incorporated that meet the definition and criteria that we've used in the catalog, we'd certainly like to know about those, because we've done our best to capture everything, but there may be other things out there that we're just not aware of. And in terms of analytic methods for employing what we currently have in the catalog, that information in and of itself is not in the catalog. Our hope is to provide some guidance as to where to go to get that information.
Yes, I think I'd like to comment on the question about the PROs, if I could. I'm sorry.
Sure. Go ahead.
I do think we did not focus on PROs. We mentioned that we discussed them a little bit in the report, in the differentiation between PROs, patient-reported outcomes, and patient preferences. But in the broad context, patient-reported outcomes are very useful in a variety of situations, particularly where the outcome is subjective and on the part of the patient, or where the patient really has to report the result because the providers can't measure it. And those are widely used. It's our expectation that patient preferences will only be useful or needed or desirable to incorporate in a limited number of situations. That PROs can be widely used in a variety of settings, but the patient preferences gets at a separate issue, which is really in the risk-benefit trade-off. How do you know you're doing that from the patient's perspective? And in situations where the patient's perspective is not obvious or clear, and where there may be real benefit-risk trade-offs, is where that patient preference information can be most valuable. So we see the use of patient preferences to be a rather narrow subset of regulatory submissions, whereas the use of patient-reported outcomes is probably a much broader-based set of situations. And I hope that is helpful.
Great, thank you. Another question with regard to patient preferences. This person says FDA trials and reimbursement trials often differ versus being a controlled versus real world. Do the methods address these different needs?
I don't think so. I don't know what else to say. No, the point is well taken. I think we need to make a distinction between, the source of the data that are acquired in either a clinical or observational study with regard to outcomes, and there are lots of different methods for doing that, and there are experts in both trial design and observational studies. I think from the preference perspective, for this particular purpose, we have looked at the methods that could be used specifically to elicit weights and or trade-offs among those endpoints for which we have clinical data or observational data. So we almost see it, the way we've been treating it here, is that they are actually two separate sources that then can be brought together.
And in a broader context, the issue of how patient preferences might be valuable in the reimbursement context is a little bit beyond the scope of our project. We were focused really, and I think needed to focus on the regulatory context, although we do, as I mentioned in the report, acknowledge the potential value of information collected for regulatory purposes in the reimbursement process. But one of the areas for further work will likely be noted to be, how do patient preferences play in reimbursement, and how might they help inform reimbursement-related technology assessments? Because right now there is no to my knowledge, no real explicit discussion of patients' views of technology in those reimbursement decisions. So I think that's a really important topic for future research, but not one that we go into in great depth in this report.
Great, thank you. I do want to mention, and just one question here, we do value input from a wide variety of industry groups, whether are industry members, whether they're large members, whether they're members of MDIC, and I know we have a couple of people here today who are here today from startups and who are not necessarily MDIC members but would like to be able to offer their feedback, and we certainly value that and welcome that feedback.
Yeah, we just want to, Stephanie, the other thing I would add to that is that we're glad to get feedback from groups who are interested. This report's not ready for widespread circulation yet, so our goal is not to get it out widely. We'll plan to do that with the publication of the final report, hopefully in the May timeframe. So we welcome the feedback of interested parties, but our goal is not to circulate this widely yet because it's still a work in progress.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us here today. I don't see any additional questions, but certainly reach out to those of you who are members, reach out to me and to the rest of the steering committee. And as you receive those materials next week, we look forward to receiving your input on this valuable report and what we hope will be a valuable report to all of our members and to the industry as a whole. As I mentioned before, this presentation has been recorded and will be available on MDIC's website. And look for some emails from me in the coming week where you'll be receiving some materials for your input and review. I want to take a moment to thank Ross and Brett for joining us today and for presenting on these materials, and again thank our entire steering committee for the hard work they've put in on this project. And thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.